Welcome back to part 2 of the Thursday edition of the Attitude with Arnie Artist and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. You know what? We actually recorded it on Wednesday morning. This is our monthly race class with Jonathan Feingold. He's a professor at Boston University Law School. We decided almost 3 years ago that legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities had spread across the country. So therefore, in an effort to respond, Law Professor Feingold and myself, Arnie Arneson, decided that we would create Race Class, a once-a-month course conversation where listeners can hear what it's like to actually learn about and approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history rather than fear and anxiety. We are up to, Jonathan, Race Class episode 29. Holy moly. And initially you sent me a note and said, let's talk a little bit about the dearth of college courses about race. And then you wanted to talk a little bit about African American studies and why does that exist, and the backlash to university presidents making agreements with protesting students about what's going on in Israel between Hamas and Gaza and Bibi Netanyahu. And I said, you know, if we're going to be also talking about race, I think we have to talk about what just happened last week. And that is the vote in Alabama at the Mercedes-Benz plant, where the UAW lost their vote to be recognized by the workers at that UAW plant by about 500 votes. It was a couple thousand to a couple thousand. And, you know, depending on, it's really interesting, Jonathan, I was looking at the headlines, and one headline was like, they got wiped out at the UAW. They got their lesson taught to them. And then the other one said it was a closed vote. It was like so interesting how this number and the interpretation depended on sort of the conservative or liberal bend of the news outlet. But one of the things that really bothered me, and the reason why I wanted to talk about what was going on in Alabama and what was going on at the Mercedes-Benz plant, was that I read something that Kay Ivey, the Republican governor, had said. And it triggered in something in me, Jonathan, that went back to my own personal history from 1996 to what was being said in 2024. So in a sad way, nothing changes, and we talk in codes. And so if you don't mind, I'm just going to sort of share what I posted on Facebook because I was just furious. And here's what I wrote. When I ran for Congress against Republican incumbent Charlie Bass, Charlie said Arnie cannot be trusted because she has New York values. Now, let me share with you what he meant. New York was code for Jew. Okay? Now, let me read you what Kay Ivey, the Republican governor of Alabama, said. She blasted the UAW and the union vote, saying, "We want to ensure that Alabama values, not Detroit values, continue to define the future of this great state." Ooh, Detroit. I think, Jonathan, that's code for black. Anyway, let me welcome you to the program. And we are so defined by codes and slogans. And we keep saying, oh, we're race neutral, we're race blind. And I keep thinking, you know, hockey puck. That's just so not true. And so much of what we're seeing, both what's going on in college campuses, what we saw at that UAW fight in Alabama, there is this race thread that connects the dots. And it is just so frightening as we see almost an elimination of anything that's trying to recognize, you know, what's happening as a result of racism and the toxicity of it. And there was the war on CRT, then there was the war on DEI. Now we're rewriting history and saying we can only talk about Western civilization, and we don't want to teach history that'll make people uncomfortable. And I keep saying which people. And I feel like the arc of history is bending the wrong way. And I have you on with me every month because I'm trying to fight it. And I'm wondering what you're thinking as you saw what's going on these campuses and as we saw what was happening with this election in Alabama. Because one of the things that the anti-union folks were doing, for example, was that they would show pictures of Sean Fain, who's the head of the UAW, and he would be surrounded by black workers, okay? And then you would see white workers going, that's the problem. Okay, so even in the ads, even in the movies, even in everything they were showing them, they were working the black and white divide, as if the black and white workers didn't need the same things. And what should hold them together was so much greater than what would take them apart. But they knew that they needed to work the divide. And that's exactly what they did. And race played a significant card. So welcome back to the program, Mr. Feingold.
Thanks, Arnie. Happy to be here. I have no I have little optimism inside of me, but it's been a enduring stretch. Let me connect a couple dots or help situate us and sort of add a little bit more texture to what you just referenced about where I initially thought we would take today. So, as you noted at the outset, we're recording on Wednesday. This will air on your show tomorrow on Thursday, and then it will go up on the race class SoundCloud and webpage. And when this airs tomorrow, we are going to be having another U.S. House Committee hearing in which Virginia Fox, the chair of the House, on a committee with Lee Stefanik and others, are going to have before them three university presidents, this time from UCLA, Rutgers, and Northwestern, as part of the new, I guess now newish, right-wing effort to weaponize legitimate anxiety about anti-Semitism in order to do all sorts of things, including quite effectively divide the left in way, like incredibly effectively divide the left, but also to discredit universities and to, in ways that I think are deeply um, concerning, to sort of normalize within society the violent repression of peaceful protest. And tomorrow there will be a couple interesting things about the dynamic tomorrow. One is that so Rutgers is has the, if not the most robust, one of the most robust faculty unions in the country. And a
Huh.
delegation of members from that faculty, including many Jewish members of that faculty, will be in DC at the hearing and holding a press conference afterwards to do a number of things. One, to reject the notion that anti-war protests that we've been seeing on university campuses are anti-Semitic, but also to call out what has been a quite intentional and opportunistic effort to really um, uh, delegitimize higher education, but also to target unions.
Right.
And
Exactly.
it's not a
Good connection.
surprise that Rutgers, with its incredibly robust union, is one of the institutions there. There's also going to be, we will hear the Republican uh, committee members disparage and seek to discredit some of the agreements that some of the university presidents have reached with their students, including at Rutgers, in which Jonathan Holloway, the president, reached a quite modest agreement, which includes trying to invest in the institutional infrastructure to support Arab and Muslim student academic inquiry and life on campus, including the creation and funding of a Arab cultural center. And that agreement has been attacked in all sorts of ways, but I connected that to African American studies because I think many people in the country right now take for granted that African American studies or Asian studies or other quote unquote ethnic studies are appropriate, if not critical aspects of a comprehensive university curriculum. We only have those because of student protests in the 1960s and
Right.
1970s.
Right. Good point.
And so,
Good
to the
point.
extent anyone is going to say you must not, for some principled reason, agree to alter institutional governance because of pressure from students engaging in some kind of protest, must at least respond to, well, what about all this stuff that we now take for granted, but would not have but for student protest? And also, to the extent one is going to suggest that university presidents should not make decisions based on students trying to exert pressure, well, then you also have to have a conversation about donors who every single day are
Exactly.
exerting pressure on institutions, and what the House GOP is doing right now, a concerted effort to wield power to shape what institutions do. And to the extent it is illegitimate for some principled reason to quote unquote negotiate with student protesters, well, then how is it somehow legitimate to be making decisions based on what some donor whose interests do not align with the institutional mission are telling you to do? So that's just some backdrop for anyone. one who's interested in seeing how university professors across the country have been responding to these committee hearings that, again, are opportunistically weaponizing legitimate anxiety about anti-Semitism to do all sorts of bad things. There is a new website that was just put up by some folks around the country uh, that is concernedlawprofessors.com.
Okay.
Concernedlawprofessors.com. That's the URL.
Okay.
It just houses a number of statements from law professors, from Jewish faculty, and others that unfortunately have their perspectives that are quite widespread, but have yet to receive, I think, appropriate attention from the mainstream press, which continues to, engage in the sort of lazy, just rehearsing of sort of standard narratives. So that's some backdrop.
Well, just think about it. I mean, let's go back. I mean, we never got anywhere without protest. I mean, women didn't get the right to vote till 1920. It didn't happen because some guy said, "Oh, I think we should expand the franchise to girls." Trust me, it didn't happen. I mean, women had to protest. Women lost their lives. Women had to do all these things. Think about the civil rights movement. And Martin Luther King is actually, when he is shot, is at a labor event, right, with the janitors. Okay, so connect the dots between labor and the civil rights movement and whatever. And I mean, when you look at all the things that have happened, they haven't happened because there has been a group of passive individuals raising their hands going, "Excuse me, can we talk about this?" It just doesn't work that way, especially when you realize, as you mentioned, the donors spend their money to maintain the status quo. The donors want basically to control the conversation, to control what they define as change. And therefore, they use their cash as a moat around the policymakers to ensure that they not only not respond to the protesters, but the only action that protesters can get, because they can't write the check, all right, is that they have to use their bodies and use their voices to say, "See me, hear me, include me." And that's one of the reasons why what we're seeing now, as we see this sort of incredible rise to fascism, we see the most grotesque inequality in America. We see some of the lowest labor union numbers ever, even though labor is finally getting its recognition. They all connect. They all connect. And I sent you an article that my former campaign manager wrote when they were trying to pass right to work in the state of New Hampshire. And you suddenly realize that through line from right to work goes right from slavery to right to work. I mean, this isn't about, about having rights or having work. It's about no rights and no work. And ultimately, when you begin to see what states actually have embraced right to work, it's all the former slave states. It's a way to keep people down. And so again, even what you saw at the UIW wasn't just about workers. It wasn't just about labor. It was about race. And if we don't constantly talk about this, Jonathan, I think we lose sight of how important the conversation about race is, because it's been the driver for so many things that have ultimately undermined our democracy and undermined our ability to be paid what we should be paid, to go to a doctor when we're sick, to getting the kind of education we need, to find an affordable home. In the end, race has been almost the underpinning of all the rot that has kept so many people from achieving what we call the American dream.
And we started doing this thing called race class in part because there was a escalating attacks on even modest conversations about race in the classroom, which was part of broader backlash to the summer of 2020, in which you did see sectors, industries in the United States shift in certainly their rhetoric, what they were saying their values were, what they cared about, but also some incremental policy changes, which again, if you're asking why was there this moment of reckoning? It wasn't just because there was some viral video of George Floyd being murdered. It was because you had unprecedented multiracial, intergenerational, cross-class protests in the country and around the world. And the reason why there was such massive shifts, again, was because of the power of protest to push those who are in seats of power to change. And then there was the backlash that ensued. We started having this show in part because um, there was also a recognition that even as many people on the street were using terms like structural racism or intersectionality, there wasn't actually much beneath the surface. Because it turns out in this country, we actually don't take seriously race as a deeply complex social phenomenon that we actually have to learn about and think about and gain analytical skills. And so, one of the things that we could do in the time we have is to try to be a little bit more precise. And so, you are simply you're recognizing that sort of race is present in all of this. And one thing that you're saying is that race is not just the category. So when you're thinking about UAW, when you're thinking about Governor Ivey, it's not just that you have this woman who would be racially identified as white in a post-Confederate state, a Jim Crow state, that is employing dog whistles in order to undermine the growth of unions in her state, unions which are sort of a necessary sort of elements of democratic society when you are a capitalist society. It's that she is actually being quite savvy in that she is using race as a tool. And so I was just looking as we're talking, our fourth episode in April of 2022, 2 years ago, over 2 years ago, we were talking about race as a political weapon. And part of that was just trying to broaden our vocabulary for thinking about what race is. So it's category, but it's also a tool. And in that episode, we talked about how it's a tool to divide multiracial coalitions. And so you reference with respect to unions. So if you have workers who self-identify as white and you can somehow position them to think about their self-interest in a way that is in opposition to other workers who they would identify as black, then you're dividing the folks who actually need to be united if you want to actually gain rights as workers. The thought experiment that is like always useful here, maybe never useful, I think is at least, interesting. So all the anti-labor rhetoric demonizes immigrants, quote unquote, taking our jobs, like who's an our, or the sort of Governor Ivey talking about Detroit values, clearly meant to be code for black. It's this notion that the precarity that you face, that the reason why your life is so hard, the reason why you don't have health insurance, why you have a low-paying job, why your kid can't get healthy food, why your neighborhood's polluted, is because of these other people. Right. Not because of this way that we now socially organize ourselves that gives all of the power to a tiny fraction of the population who owns everything. And so the thought experiment is, if somehow, Trump's in office and deports everyone he doesn't identify as white.
Which is ultimately, I hate to say this, but we keep thinking that it's all of the undocumented. No, ask someone. It's driving while Hispanic. It's driving while black. They're going to scoop people up and they're not necessarily going to ask questions. We're talking about anywhere from 5 to 7% of the population he wants to warehouse and then ship. It is so scary when you think about it, Jonathan, because people keep thinking, but it's not me. That's not true. It is you. And I don't know how we sort of broaden that conversation, because people keep thinking, oh, he doesn't mean me. He does.
And I guess the thought experiment is just that, like, if somehow, this magical world in which you snap your fingers and all of the other people who are demonized by the Governor Ivies of the world if they're just not present. Obviously, that does not change the precarity that everyone faces now, still faces. Like nothing gets better. Also in this episode 2 years ago, we talk about how race is deployed to distract from the systems that produce our shared precarity. Like that's another aspect of it. When Governor Ivey is demonizing the union through racially inflected rhetoric, she's also distracting from all the ways in which her state, through its policies, actually make it very difficult to get the things one needs to just live with dignity in a country that has so much wealth. And so it's all those things. And then she also has this comment that you didn't reference about where she accuses the union for being the cause of Detroit's sort of disinvestment in Detroit and the challenges Detroit faces. And so this is like this other interesting move where race is both there in the sense that Governor Ivey is trading on the way in which we understand certain localities to be sort of race in a particular way, how we associate it, but also it's erasing all of the sort of racial history that is Detroit. And the fact that why did Detroit initially have a massive rise in the population of people who we'd racially identify as Black? Well, it's because Great Migration, people who were fleeing places like Alabama, where there was massive racial terror, thinking maybe you would be able to find greater safety for yourself and your family outside of the South. And you had union jobs, like in Detroit, like UAW, that would be able to pay you a more decent wage. But then it turns out that the North isn't all that much different than the South. And so in the 60s, you had uprisings in many northern cities because of the same sorts of racialized police violence against African Americans and others. And then you have the coinciding with the national civil rights movement. And then through the late 60s through the 80s, that's when you experience white flight in places like Detroit, where you have white communities who flee with their wealth, with their privilege, and then the state more broadly engages in quite active disinvestment, in which creates the cities that we now know. And then you also have Supreme Court decisions like Milliken v. Bradley, in which the Supreme Court effectively insulates from any sort of
oversight,
legal relevance, all of the intersecting forces that are all racially inflected, including white flight, including state-sanctioned disinvestment, just legally irrelevant. And such that if you are now essentially trapped in Detroit with all the money going elsewhere, and you're a student, and you're now in a school that's more segregated than ever before, and the surrounding white schools are even more segregated because they're all white, Brown v. Board of Education doesn't do anything.
Exactly. Oh my God, Jonathan, we have to talk. There's so much happening right at the same time. Once a month, we get to hang out with Jonathan Feingold. He's a professor of law at Boston University Law School. We've been doing this thing called Race Class for almost 3 years. We need to continue to do Race Class. This is Race Class episode 29. We will schmooze with you in a month, Jonathan. Thank you so much for doing this. This, everyone, is the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arnesen and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. We will talk tomorrow.